Um, Welcome. For those of you who are just joining me, I've been reading a manuscript, and while I'm reading it, I'm marking it down for editing. This is the third book now that I've been doing this with. So if you're interested, you can go back and watch my other two, or you can even go back to my past broadcasts and watch the beginning of this story. This story is actually a sequel to Talisman of the Winds, which was my very first book I streamed. And yeah, tonight I am on chapter 13 and 15. So what'll happen is I will be wrapping it up this week. I'm either going to be, I'll probably be wrapping it up on the Thursday, and then I'll be taking another few weeks, a couple weeks break. While I'm doing that, I'll be deciding on what story I'm going to do next, and also trying to work out edits, because now I basically now have 3 books to edit. One of them fairly deep edits to do, plus if I keep on streaming, then I'm going to have even more books to work on edits with. I mean, although to be fair, they're marked up so I can kind of come back to them at any time, and I can always review these past streams. One of the reasons why I'm doing this, because editing and reading out loud helps with the editing process. So that is why I'm doing it. Also, so I can practice talking to people. At any rate, without further ado, I will start with Stonecaller, chapter 13. It was difficult, but not altogether impossible, for a person to speak to Quedrim alone. Gwathnerin assigned a pair of guards to be with him at all times, despite the annoyance it caused Quedrim. The commander only stated, "You are too important to the lady to be risked to some fool with a knife in the marketplace, and in case you're thinking about evading the guards, understand that you will not be punished, but they will be. Staying with you is part of their duty. If they fail, they can expect to be punished. Just as they could expect to be punished for coming on parade with a rust spot on their spear blade." It would have been easier if the guards had irritated him, but they were always polite, though not servile. He could have evaded them from time to time, but to condemn a pair of decent fellows to punishment just because he, Quedrim, disliked having Gwathnerin rule his life? No, that was not something he could do. If he were drinking in a wine shop, though, and had to go to the alley to relieve himself, one guard would come to the nearby, but the fellow would not have the effrontery to stand at Quedrim's elbow all the while. So if a person who had been drinking in the same wine shop went out into the alley at the same time, he might stand within whispering distance of Quedrim, and mutter a message only Quedrim could hear. The guard would not interfere unless the fellow moved too quickly or seemed to be about to draw a weapon. In this case, the man said, "There will be a message of some interest delivered to your table." He didn't bother waiting for an answer, but finished what he'd been doing and went back into the wine shop. Shortly after, Quedrim went back in. A man, not quite a beggar, but by his dress, not far away from being a beggar, came to his table. "I have a talisman for sale here, a talisman to prevent the bad head that comes of drinking wine." He reached into his clothing, but one of the guards had a sword point pointing at his middle. "Best not be any metal in that hand when it comes out, fellow," the guard growled. The man stared at the sword. "Oh, no metal, Lord. Only a talisman, if the Lord is interested." He pulled his hand out slowly, shaking with nervousness, which caused him to fumble around, dropping several bits of paper and the talisman itself. It was nothing more than 2 feathers bound together with a thin leather cord. I think not, fellow. I know a bit about talismans, and despite what many people wish, there is no such thing as a talisman to prevent a wine headache. Best take it and try to sell someone more gullible. The man bent over the table and extended his hands in entreaty, about to make a further plea. However, he moved a bit too fast, and one of the guards was there to wrap his arms around the man, hauling him away to the door and ejecting him. Among the bits and pieces that had fallen when the man had brought his hand out of his clothing was a leather scrap with a few words on it in the common language. If you're at your chamber door at the 3rd hour after midnight, you may hear a proposition which may interest you. Very interesting, Quedrum thought. So someone can get agents into the Carmista's palace, or rather, they have them there already. He had no concern about either guard being able to read the message. Few people could read, and soldiers were less likely than most to be able to read. It seemed like a reasonable notion to listen to the offer before he turned the matter over to the guards. If I get myself killed, Wagner will hate me. The man who met him was in servant's dress, though Quedrum realized that he may have gotten the clothing elsewhere, the better to walk the palace halls unchallenged. He was little and brown, and his face held no expression. Lord Falcedon has authorized me to present you with a purse of 20 gold pieces if you will agree to enter his employ. Quedrum shook his head only slightly. I think not. I am in the ladies' service and happy here. He realized he could be in serious danger here. The king might well want to have him dead if he couldn't be bought. If the man tried to move close or too quickly. You're sure of this? The king can ward you amply. Yes, I'm quite sure. The little man shrugged. So be it. He turned to go. A moment later, he had whipped around, brought out a dagger, and lunged at Quedrum. Quedrum, ready for such a move, dodged right, slapped the knife forward, and kicked at the knee. He didn't connect squarely, but near enough to keep the fellow from attacking again. He flipped the knife towards Quedrum's face, turned, and ran. Quedrum ducked under the knife and heard it go clattering against the wall. By the time he was ready to go in pursuit, the assassin had turned the corner of the hallway. By the time he got to that corner, the man was no longer in sight. Now, he thought, if I go along opening all the doors, I'll cause a lot of excitement, barging in on people. But I won't likely catch him, since he'd have worked out his escape in advance. He went back to report the adventure to his guards, and to Wagner at least. You took too big a chance! Wagner was angry, but not to the point of shouting. You ought to have reported the first approach, then let us handle the matter. And how would you have done it then? Have guards on all the hallways so the fellow got scared off, leaving us with nothing? Nothing, Quedrum, is what we're left with now. Only your report of the incident, and a description of a person, which may not be the person's true appearance at all. We know the king is worried enough to want to try to buy me. I think we could have guessed that without all this fodderall. And I know you're about to say you did do what you thought was best. Next time, let someone know. It's just possible someone might know better than you do. Despite all the efforts at sending placating gifts along with reasons why the king's requests could not be complied with, the king lost patience at last and declared war as soon as the campaigning season opened. It was a bleak council that met that evening. Well, there is one hopeful element in this, the lady said. Several Carmosts are unwilling to march against us. Huh, grunted Wagner. Only the ones we wouldn't have had to worry much about anyway. The ones whose armies are hardly worthy of the name. You could have at least left me something to feel better about, old wolf, she smiled at him. He smiled back, a slightly forced smile. military facts or military facts, Anarchy, will be invaded, likely from 2 directions, perhaps more, which means on the one hand we fight 2 battles at least, but on the other hand we will not be quite so badly outnumbered in any one battle, unless we allow the forces to join before we fight them. And if we decide to fight them before they join, we'll be forced to use some long and hard marching with all the wear on our forces that entails. He turned to Quedrum. What can you do for us here? Quedrum frowned. On the one hand, we won't have to deal with the invulnerable enemies. On the other hand, we'll have to deal with a large number of ordinary ones. I have some thoughts, though. Not being a military man, I must ask, how do you choose your battlefields? It's always seemed almost as if both sides march until they meet each other and then fight on the field in between. Quothnarin barked out a laugh. It's all part of the business of generalship, to make sure you meet up with the enemy on a field that's at least somewhat acceptable to your force, preferably with something to anchor your flanks, a river or a good hill, a wood or the like. Of course, you want to find this spot just soon enough the enemy has to come at you from the front, and not as soon as he has a chance to work around one of your flanks. Most times, a few contingents of the light infantry or light cavalry take care of this flanking business. In the case the numbers the king can bring against us, we can't be certain of that, so we have to arrange to meet him on a ground of our choosing, or at least near enough he doesn't have the opportunity to work around our flanks. Does that help you at all? I wish I could exactly say yes or no. I suppose I lay out what I'm thinking of, and you say whether there's some way we could make it work. Quothnarin bobbed his head shortly. Go ahead. 2 weeks later found them marching towards Dara. A large contingent of Dori would meet them on the march, and from there they would continue to where an army from 2 other Karmostats were invading in the name of the king. 2 Karmostats led this invasion, though one of them, Sosindus, had or presumed a trifle more seniority. Give me a minute here. The Kafradi leaders hoped they could deal with these troops, then march back along their track to meet the king, who would be invading from the other direction. With sufficient luck, they could meet the king before he had time to do more than invest Higfrid. Catching him with his forces spread out around the city might even be the best, Quothnarin had said, but we can't count on that much. We can't count on that much good luck. Come on, Quedrum, give us a little hint. Genelabas's voice was almost querulous. We know, the whole army knows, that you and Lord Quothnarin have worked out a plot between you to defeat the old Sosindus without the rest of the army having to draw a sword. Why can't you tell your closest friends? Because if it ever gets out, and I'm not saying that you nor Melsa are blabbermouths, but if it ever gets out, Quothnarin will have my hide. And I like my hide just the way it is, attached to me. You say you know we're not blabbermouths. You say you trust us, but you won't trust us enough to give us anything to be trusted with. Some fine trust that is. Come on, Jenny, look at it this way. This is a lady's secret. Hers, mine, and Quothnarin's. You wouldn't want me blabbing out the ladies' secrets, would you? The discontented nod was as much agreement as Quedrum had expected. Quedrum rode back to the main force. 200 horse archers accompanied him, just in case. Though it was known that it was a known fact that the enemy were still a day's march away. It's those known facts that always turn around and bite you in the butt, Quothnarin had said. He had made a survey of the land where the enemy would likely be camping just before the battle. That kind of thing couldn't always be predicted with absolute certainty, but being near to the mark would be enough. It was another known fact that the Swasindas didn't have enough troops to waste any by making moves toward the Higford rear. Another known fact, this one a fact that could be counted on more than most known facts, was that Swasindas was nowhere near to being an inspired tactician. He could probably be counted on to get a superior force to the field of battle and array it in a reasonably sensible fashion, but after that, it'd be up to the troops to grind their way to victory. There weren't likely to be any clever tactical maneuvers. Quedrum rode back through the Grafrodi lines, conscious of all the eyes on him. Any soldier who didn't recognize him was most likely standing next to somebody who knew him. The word would be passed that he had been looking things over, and there'd be 4 or 5 different stories as to what he'd planned to do for the day of the fight. Hope I can live up to your expectations, he thought. The morning of the battle came, altogether quickly. You ready, Quedrum? Gwathnarin had his helmet pushed back on his head for better visibility. When the time came to fight, he'd pull the helmet down and depend on what he could see through the eye slits. I am. You know this is likely to stretch me a little. You have someone ready to take care of me if I fall over? Of course! There was an annoyance in Gwathnarin's response, as this ought to go without saying. Well, that was too bad. It wasn't going to be Gwathnarin passing there on the field, vulnerable to anyone and everyone. Well, our lot are falling in, and the enemy are doing the same. Time to get to work. Gwathnarin turned and rode off before Quedrum had a chance to feel annoyed at the man for ordering him around. By the time he did, he realized Gwathnarin might well have been talking to himself anyway. It was time for him to get to work, though. His ability at moving stones seemed to be limited to stones within sight, though he had been working at that, picking up stones behind him. It was still a fact that he had to have seen the stone, wherever it might be, but he could manage it. So now, he commanded all those stones he had seen in their places over in the area of the enemy camp to rise up. He'd never tried lifting so many, nor in such a vaguely defined places, but the effort it took indicated from past experience that he was moving a large number of stones. He brought them over and stacked them in a long pile, just in front of the lines of the Grafrodi light infantry on the left flank. It hadn't been necessary to take the stones from where the enemy were. This had been a small ploy to shake the morale of the enemy before they came to battle, driving home to them the fact that there was a man over here who could command stones. In fact, it was necessary to augment the line of stones with more that had been gathered in ox carts for him. Even the Grafrodi troops seemed a little rattled at the stones suddenly flying up to take their places in front. And their commanders were supposed to have warned them last night, too, Quedrum thought. So now, he said to himself, and raised the stones, this was not a dry stone wall, not by any means. It was a wall of sorts, about 3 feet high, 1 stone wide, and at least 50 feet in length. Quedrum's will alone held the stones balancing on each other, and they moved forward toward the enemy. The enemy infantry who faced this wall looked a little uncertain. Lost their dressing badly as the stone wall advanced on them, and when it collided with their ranks, most of them broke and fled. Those in that 50-foot stretch who didn't flee were pushed back by the inexorable advance of the stone wall, which moved as one unit. Abruptly, a whole section of the enemy line was fleeing. Those who had been on the flanks of the whole were shaken. Some officers tried to extend the line to cover the hole, but this only caused their dressing to become worse. Then Quedrum brought the stone wall back. He thought at first to make it a wheel, like a finely drilled infantry force, but there wasn't time. Instead, he marched it rapidly to his left, then brought it back. When the 50-foot section of the enemy infantry found themselves trapped between a moving stone wall and armed troops in front. Their morale collapsed. In a rushing panic, they sought to escape on the flanks. On their right were their own troops. On the left was a small gap, which an evolution of Gafrati troops was rapidly closing. Quedrim wheeled a stone wall this time in a broad circle leftward to catch more enemy troops and allow the remnants who had been caught in the first trap to flee, which they did, with no one attempting to rally when the wall was gone. By now, the Gafrati troops had wheeled sharply to hit the enemy troops in the flanks of the now larger hole. Quedrim let his stone wall fall. The dust had been a problem on other battlefields. The dust that had been a problem on other battlefields was a problem here as well. He couldn't see how far down the enemy ranks, how far down the rank the enemy's disorder had gone. Not that it mattered much. With the Gafrati troops through a gap of over 1,000 feet and rolling the enemy up, the battle was practically won. Nevertheless, he urged his horse down further leftward on the Gafrati line. It wouldn't take long for him to bring his stones from where he'd dropped them, if he needed them again. As it happened, it wasn't necessary. Nor was he even so worn out that he collapsed. He did, however, fall asleep when it was clear he wouldn't be needed any longer, and didn't wake up until late the next morning. And now we march against the king? Quedrim, the success of his plan against Sosinda's making him bold, found himself willing to speak on matters of strategy. Gwatherin shook his head. We march on Higfrid. That's where the king will have been making for. Let's hope he won't have managed to trick the city into surrender before we arrive. Surely they won't surrender the city as long as they know we're loose. They shouldn't. But that sort of thing is like, known facts. Suppose the king somehow convinces them he's already met and defeated us. What good would it do the city to hold out? All they'd get would be worse terms when this king eventually wins. So we'll go up on the assumption that the city hasn't been taken, but we'll consider what we'll do if the worst happens. Or maybe I could convince the king to bet his kingdom against my ability to hit a target 3 times in 5? Gwatherin frowned slightly, but Quedrim's performance in battle had been enough to gain him a little leeway. The king has just finished some tricky work to gain the throne against bad odds. He'd need a good mind to be able to manage the ins and outs of that. Good enough that he wouldn't be easily fooled. Anavristi spoke up. We know they tried to bribe Quedrim. I wonder how many bribes we didn't find out about. Gwatherin shrugged. No way to know, except to take close precautions. He turned to face Quedrim. You too, Quedrim. All it needs is for someone to put a knife between your ribs, and we've lost a big advantage. Not to mention that I'd be dead, Quedrim said, stung at being referred to as less as a person than as an important weapon. I don't think I'd care for that at all. I wouldn't mind that either, Quedrim, said Anavristi. Make sure you stay safe. Sobeldancer, whose strong dislike of Quedrim appeared to have moderated to a general distaste for him, glowered slightly. There are others who have served the lady well, wielding more ordinary weapons in her service. The lady turned to him. And so there have been, Lord Sobeldancer, and we appreciate your work as well. Without you, and warriors like you, Quedrim could only be effective up to the point when slingers or archers came within range of him. And without Quedrim, we might well have won this battle, but at the cost of being unable to fight the next battle, which will come all too soon. All of those who risk their lives in my service are appreciated, no matter how they serve. Thank you, lady. and of Aristides' words appeared to soothe the old lord, though Quedrin wondered just how much. Sometimes it seems the lady's service is a long, forced march, groused Malsanto. Seems we're never satisfied with getting somewhere. We always have to get there fast. This isn't really a forced march, Malsa. Now the march to Dara, that was a forced march. This was just a bit of a hurry. Ah, Lord Quedrin with big stones, having marched with the lady's forces a few times, is now a veteran campaigner, and I suppose the next thing we know, you'll be lecturing us on the tactics Lord Gwathnoran used, and telling us how they might be improved. Quedrin grinned. No, I won't go quite that far. I will say my backside isn't as sore as it was on that march to Dora. My judgment about this march is based on that. Oh, and it didn't occur to you that perhaps your backside has gotten more used to riding, so that this time, though we're riding just as hard, it doesn't feel so bad? Quedrin laughed. Don't worry, we're making good time for the few days. Then we'll drop back to a more sedate pace. That way, we've gained a couple of days on the king, without ending up worn to a stub when we finally meet him. The king and his army are camped around the walls of Higfrid, Lord. The dusty horse archer brought the news to Gwathnoran at the head of the marching column. Ah, good, good. Their strength? My commander didn't take time for a careful count before he sent me off, Lord. But I'd say there's a third to a quarter again our force. Gwathnoran nodded. That seems to be about what we estimated. As long as they don't have any other forces hidden away in the neighborhood. Quedrin! Yes, Lord? When Gwathnoran spoke in that commander's voice of his, it took strong willpower to avoid answering like the merest of soldiers. You have an idea for this one? I don't think His Highness will allow you to scout out his campground, not even if you ask politely. I have an idea or so. It might not have the same morale effect, but I think I give him something to think about. I'd still end up with the wall formation. That worked well enough last time. There's no sense changing a good thing. Unless you know your enemy will expect it. But I think you're probably right this time. They won't likely have heard what we did to Sostindus. Okay. And that is that chapter. Yeah, it's not quite as rough as the chapter before that, but I still have a few things I'd kind of like to go over. I'm sorry if there was a lot of strategy. My dad he thrived on military strategy, so if that's not your thing, then this probably wouldn't be a good story for you. But you've stayed so far, so I imagine this might be interesting to you. I'll be back again tomorrow, and like I said before, I'll be back tomorrow with another chapter, and then I'll be taking Canada Day off, and then I'll be back on the Thursday. So I will see you tomorrow night. Have a good night, and I'll talk to you soon.